Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining MOVA's Grants Policies and Procedures FY26 Updates meeting. I'm seeing some participants still trickling in, so we'll give it a few moments to get started. Thanks again for joining us today. We just learned that we had 230-ish people register for today's training, so we're expecting quite an audience today. We have about 145 people in the room right now, so again, just giving it another moment or so before we begin going through some of the content. Okay. The waiting room is slowing down, so I'm going to jump into it. Thank you again for joining MOVA's Grants Policies and Procedures FY26 Overview and Updates discussion. I'm going to, before I go into introductions, I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping items. So today is a Zoom webinar. You cannot be seen or heard as audience members, but you can see the presenters and the presentation. There are closed captions available during today's session. To view the closed captions, go to the bottom of your screen, click on the arrow next to live transcript and choose show subtitle. If you are experiencing any technical issues today, please use the chat function and message all panelists, and somebody will be happy to assist you. And we also ask that any questions that you have today are put into the questions and answers function, which is the Q&A function found on the Zoom toolbar. Any questions that are placed in the chat function may be overlooked. We'll do our best to address any questions that are placed in the questions and answers during today's session. And we'll leave time at the end to answer any additional questions that may come up throughout the presentation. The last thing I would like to cover is that the presentation is being recorded. We anticipate that the recording will be posted to MOVA's website in the near future, and we'll also share a constant contact once this recording is available, and we'll also put the slides on our website. So we have a couple facilitators today from MOVA. So I am Kristen Wen. I'm the Director of Grants Administration at the Massachusetts Office of Victim Assistance. And I'm going to introduce my co-facilitators. I'm joined by Laura Fox, who is MOVA's Monitoring and Compliance Manager. I'm joined by Kristen Tabano, who is the Deputy Director of Grants Administration. And last but not least, I'm also joined by Madeline Gorman, who is MOVA's Deputy Chief of Staff, and Madeline will be helping with the questions and answers today and keeping an eye on our chat. Also too, I just noticed a raised hand. We don't have the ability to unmute any attendees, so if you do have a question throughout, again, please put that in the questions and answers function. A few objectives of our training today, training overview. It's kind of an overview of the high level changes that we've made. So recently we made several improvements to our MOVA Grants Policies and Procedures manual. We will be going through what those improvements were today, helping you develop a clear understanding of what those updates were and any key policy updates that were made in FY26. And a meeting objective today will also be to answer any questions about the grants policies and procedures that you may have. Our agenda today is on the screen. So as I just mentioned, we will go through the PMP policies and procedures manual accessibility updates that were recently announced. Some key policy updates, which include policies around bonuses for personnel, and updates related to uniform guidance for federal assistance. Laura will be going through some common technical assistance topics, which include financial management, timesheet expectations, funding source acknowledgements, and data prorating and data reporting. I will be going over the annual civil rights requirements that we go through each year when we do this training. Kristen will be going through updates and reminders, and then we will open it up for any questions and answers that you may be looking for. So that is our agenda. The first item that I will cover today is the PMP manual accessibility enhancements. And before I jump into this, I again just wanted to thank everybody for joining on this hot July day, almost August. I can't believe it. I understand that, you know, many people may have questions around what's happening federally, and we will do our best to answer anything that may come up or that may come to mind related to that. But I wanted to thank everybody. I know it's been a challenging time budget-wise, what's happening on the policy front. So just acknowledging that before we jump into the content today, and thank you for your time and attendance today to this annual training. So I am excited to discuss some of the policy and procedure manual accessibility enhancements that were recently announced. So just some context related to this. So we have been, each year we make updates to our grants policies and procedures manual. We look at the allowable costs, the unallowable costs, any policies that may not make sense, that may have come up during program monitoring that we want to offer some additional clarification on or additional support on. And one thing that we recognized in the past few years was that the grants policies and procedures manual historically has been extremely lengthy. And I will admit it is still lengthy, but vastly improved. And the content overall is complex in being able to translate complex policy, complex procedures into something that is a document that is more accessible and readable for our audience was our overall goal. So over the past 2 years, MOVA had partnered with Language Line Solutions to significantly revise our grants policies and procedures manual. And our project with Language Line was to convert our existing manual into plain, accessible language. So we, over time, over the past 2 years, have been working hand in hand with them to identify what areas felt complex, what we could communicate differently, in different formats that we could communicate, like rather than having large bodies of text, like what could we put in bullet form, for example, just to make the document overall more accessible and readable into that plain language accessibility. So over this past spring, we had released a call for volunteers to review the updated manual and to respond to a brief survey about what areas may have required some clarification, what could improve, and overall thoughts on the changes related to the policies and procedures manual. So after this call for volunteers, we had about 17 people who had responded to our survey. And this group consisted of currently funded grantees, but their task was really to review the previous FY25 policies and procedures manual, and then to review the draft FY26 manual, which is the accessible version, and provide feedback on what felt like it was missing, if there was any information that felt like it was missing, and what could we improve on. So the survey did wrap up in May, and we released the FY26 version in June. And any feedback that we received from the survey was collected, it was considered, and we applied that feedback from the survey respondents into our policies and procedures manual. And I'm proud to talk about this because this was, in my experience, one of the first times that we have opened up an opportunity for stakeholders to review and provide feedback on a document that impacts them the most. So we were happy to implement the feedback that we were able to, and some of the comments that I just wanted to share with the group that is in attendance today. We did receive overwhelmingly positive feedback on the improvements of this manual and some consistent feedback. And I'm just quoting some of the comments that we received. Every section was easily understood and recalled, and that the manual sets a tone of collaboration, and that in comparing it to the 25 version, the effort into making the content more readable and simple is evident. So thank you for those who were able to review and provide feedback and respond to that survey. We really appreciated the collaborative effort on that, and we're excited that we have now released this version, and we hope that audience members find it easier to understand and more digestible than the previous version. One of the efforts that in the changes that we made to the FY26 manual, we are transitioning some of the shared language that we use. So calling the organizations that receive funding from MOVA subrecipients, we're using terms such as grantee moving forward. Expenditure report is now maybe called an expense report. You'll see these changes happening in e-grants over time. The more kind of immediate step was making these changes to the policies and procedures manual. Request for grant applications, we're simplifying that into just simply grant applications. The reason that we are transitioning some of this language is to reflect on common and recognizable terms that may be used by other funders or other grants that your organizations receive. Some of the feedback that we received from LanguageLine was to reduce the number of syllables, which would therefore reduce the reading level score, and using less acronyms and less jargon. So that was a major effort in changing some of the shared language that you may see across different platforms and resources and documents that MOVA releases. And in addition to the language changes that you'll see in the FY26 policies manual, the reading score has also changed. The previous FY25 policies and procedures manual was scored at a grade 16 reading level, and now with the changes that we've recently implemented, it is now a grade 9 reading level. So I think that that's an improvement, and again, happy to share the work that we have done in collaboration with stakeholders to make this happen. Overall, in making these changes to the FY26 policies and procedures manual, largely the policies have remained the same. There are a couple updates that I would like to share, updates, points of clarification that have come up over the last year that we would like to share and make sure everyone is aware of, and answer any questions that you may have related to this. So one of the updates that we made was related to bonuses. And that key update is that bonuses for employees must be included in the original budget submitted as part of the grant application. So recently, everybody has submitted their budgets for the FY26 grant renewal, and those are being finalized if they have not been finalized already in collaboration with your MOVA program coordinator. So with this policy change, it would have been in, Kristen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that this was also communicated when we released the policies and procedures manual and in contracting conditions as well. That's not necessarily to say that bonuses won't be approved later on in the year. However, if bonuses are requested through a budget amendment during the fiscal year, post the contracting and award cycle, we will ask for additional justification, and we may have more questions or more layers to go through if that comes later on in the year. A couple of examples that I would like to provide related to like an example of something that we may approve and an example of something that may not be approved. So An example that may be approved is incentive bonuses, like if your organization is facing vacancies, therefore you have funding in your personnel budget that is unspent or that is unallocated. You may be able to consider incentive bonuses in order to fill that position and to bring folks into the door to hire. So that is an example of something that we've seen over the past year that may be considered after the initial budget is approved for FY26. An example that may not be approved is at the end of the fiscal year, and we see this often, but at the end of the fiscal year, you're working on your final budget amendment in May, and maybe your organization realizes that there's $10,000 that may go unspent that is either in the personnel category or in a different category. And then at the final hour in May or June, that is now allocated for bonuses in order to spend down your grant award. That is an example that may require more justification or that may not be approved by your program coordinator. So trying to be more transparent in those examples and offer some clarification related to this policy. Additional information related to bonuses. So this information is unchanged from previous years. And this has been part of the bonuses policy since we have included it over the past few years. They are an allowable expense. For them to be allowable, they must be reasonable, necessary to support the work funded under the award, and distributed equally to all employees without regard of the funding source being used. They must also be appropriately and equitably distributed among funded staff according to the percentage of their time that is funded under the award. So a really simple example of what this could look like. If you are funding a part-time employee that works, let's say that your full-time employee hours are 40 hours a week. This employee works 20 hours on the grant, and all employees are receiving a $1,000 bonus at the end of the year. The part-time employee under MOVA's grant would be paid $500 through the MOVA award. If there was a full-time employee, and these bonuses are distributed equitably across employees in the organization, they would get the $1,000 because they're a full-time employee under the award. So hopefully those examples are clear, but again, happy to answer any questions that may come to mind related to bonuses. Another few examples. So we have allowed these changes starting in since last October, so October 2024. This is when those changes took place, and now the policies and procedures manual reflects these changes. So in October of 2024, there were several changes that were made to the Office of Management and Budget, which is a federal organization, the Uniform Guidance for Federal Financial Assistance. A few things that impact, a few things related to these changes that impact the awards that we distribute at MOVA. For those that receive a de minimis indirect cost rate, it is allowed now to increase that from 10% to 15%. The threshold for defining equipment and capitalization level has increased from $5,000 to $10,000. And the single audit threshold, which determines when an organization must conduct a single audit, has increased from $750,000 to $1 million in federal awards. So I'll have some points of clarification related to that as well. But lastly, the definition of modified total direct costs has been updated to include the first $50,000 of each subaward. So some additional points of clarification related to these updates and how it may relate to your MOVA award. For those who are receiving a de minimis indirect cost rate, if you have not already, you may submit a budget amendment to increase that rate from 10% to 15% in allowed costs. This does not mean the awards increase. The awards were issued over the past few months, and in May they were distributed. So the awards are what they are for FY26. However, you may submit and move around some funding in order to increase your indirect cost rate if that is something that you would look to do. For the equipment, defining equipment threshold, this is something that a question that we have run into the past year, so we also wanted to clarify this, but items such as cell phones or printers would be considered program supplies and not equipment. This is often because they don't get up to that threshold, but just ensuring that it's clear what the definition of equipment in terms of this federal language, and then supplies is separate. And for the single audit threshold, so it's if you receive more than $1 million in federal awards, your organization must conduct a single audit. So if you receive 500,000 in federal awards and then 500,000 state awards, it would not go under that kind of guideline of single audit, needing to conduct a single audit. But if you now receive more than $1 million in federal awards, you must go through that process. That ends my piece for now. So I am going to pass it to Laura to go through some common technical assistance topics. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Kristen. Hi, everyone. As Kristen said, my name is Laura Fox. I'm a monitoring and compliance manager at MOVA, and I'm going to be talking about some common technical assistance topics. These are topics that grantees often have questions about. Next slide. The first technical assistance topic I'm going to talk about is tracking funding and revenue sources in your accounting records. MOVA grantees must have a financial management system that can track all of your expenses and reimbursements related to your MOVA grant. Your accounting system should be able to separate the financial activity tied to your MOVA grant from any other expenses or funding your agency receives. It's also important that you're tracking revenue, meaning the reimbursements you get from MOVA, by funding source. Some grantees are going to be receiving more than one revenue stream to support your grant in FY26. You can see what revenue streams you can expect to receive this fiscal year on the award letter addendum that was part of contracting and e-grants. But the best and most accurate way to see what funding you receive from MOVA each month is to look at the MOVA only section on each expense report. You can see what that looks like in the next slide. So as you can see here, this is a screenshot of a sample July expense report in eGrants. To find the revenue sources that were used to reimburse this expense report, first you click on the Expenditure Summary tab on the left-hand side. Then scroll all the way down to the bottom of that summary page. Here you'll see the MOVA Use Only section. MOVA fills this out after you receive the reimbursement. In this example, the two revenue sources for the July expense report were $12,551 of VOCA 22 money and $500 of COVID-19 trust dollars. In this example, the grantee would need to make sure that those two different revenue streams are coded that way in the organization's accounting records. It's a good practice to check this MOVA Use Only section after receiving reimbursement from MOVA every month to make sure that you're tracking the grant funds by the correct revenue streams in your accounting records. Next slide. The next topic is timesheets. An electronic system is an acceptable method of tracking grant-funded or match employee time. You can also use paper timesheets. Your time recording system must be able to track MOVA funded time separately from other funded time. Here you see an example of a timesheet that separates MOVA funded grant time from other funding sources. In this example, the staff member, John Smith, on August 11th, 2025, worked 7 hours of MOVA/VSS time and 1 hour of other funded hours time. This example has MOVA/VSS as the label for the grant time. Other acceptable labels would be CSVS if you have a CSVS award, or Safe Plan if you have a Safe Plan award. When it comes time for a desk review or expense report review, MOVA will be looking at your employee timesheets and will be checking to see that all the MOVA time recorded on employee timesheets reconciles with the employee time that we see on the expense reports. And timesheets also must be approved by the employee and the supervisor. Next topic is funding source acknowledgement statements. We used to call these funding source attribution statements, and we changed the name this year. All materials publicizing your MOVA grant program or resulting from grant funding, so like brochures, flyers, pamphlets, etc., must contain some version of the funding source acknowledgement statement. This can include printed materials and electronic materials, such as your organization's website. Examples of funding source acknowledgements can be found on page 22 of the Policies and Procedures Manual. The example in the MOVA P&P is, this project was partially supported by MOVA through state investments and/or a Victims of Crime Act of 1984 VOCA grant from the Office for Victims of Crime, Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice, and/or the Human Trafficking and Drunk Driving Trust Funds. You can edit the statement you use so that it lists the funding sources that you receive from MOVA. And the last technical assistance topic I'll be covering is OMT data proration. When completing the OMT quarterly report, you should only report data that was supported by your MOVA grant. Organizations that have services or staff partially supported by a MOVA grant and partially supported by other funding sources should have an accurate method to track which services or time are supported by the MOVA grant versus those that were supported by other funding. If such a method is not in place or is not possible, you have to have a prorating strategy to ensure that data is being reported accurately. So for example, if employee A's time is supported half by the grant, half by other funding sources, then you would be reporting half of employee A's data on the OMT. MOVA may request amendments to OMT submissions if staff are added or removed from a grantee budget. When it comes time for a site visit, we're going to be asking to see at least 1/4 of OMT backup documentation, which means it could be a report run from a database or an activity log with all redacted PII. You can also use MOVA's data tracker that is found on MOVA's website. When we are reviewing the OMT backup, we're looking to see that each data point on the OMT is traceable to the numbers on the backup documentation, including demographics, direct services, goals, and key outcomes. And we encourage you to reach out for technical assistance with this topic and with any other technical assistance questions. And that's all I got.
Thank you, Laura. In just a moment too, one of our panelists will drop the OMT resources in the chat. We have a data proration tool that our data team has worked hard on to provide as a resource for folks. As Laura mentioned, there's lots of other resources in our website too that can be used for this purpose. But thank you, Laura, for going through the common technical assistance topics. Next, I will be covering the annual civil rights requirements when you are receiving a grant from MOVA. So we present this information annually to remind grantees what the requirements are related to civil rights when receiving a grant from us. And largely, there hasn't been any changes to the civil rights requirements. However, there are some updates related to the EEOP process that I will share today as we go through this material. So the first requirement is related to the civil rights training, and the purpose of completing this requirement is to ensure that grantees understand the overall civil rights compliance requirements that come when receiving a federal grant, specifically a grant from the Office for Victims of Crime. So at least one key agency representative is required to complete this training each year. This can be the program contact, the financial contact, your director of your program or organization. It just has to be a minimum of one person that completes this training. The link can be found in the slide, and it's also available within the policies and procedures manual to access this training. Again, we'll share the slides that are being presented today, so then you can have access to these links that we're talking about if you can't find them in the policies and procedures training. When you click on this link for the civil rights training, there are video recordings that go through the specific sections that you'll have to review and cover for the training requirement. And there is also a transcript that you can read through. And while the videos and transcripts are available, there is no formal certification of completion that's issued. It's kind of just a series of like YouTube videos that you'll watch and that we'll expect each grantee organization to complete each year. So part of our monitoring, we would ask that you keep track of who at your organization has completed this requirement and when they completed that, so we can ensure that it was completed during the fiscal year or during your contract period. So we will ask for that during monitoring, and there is also forms during contracting that we remind folks about this requirement. So I'll start with sharing an update. So next we're going to be covering the Equal Employment Opportunity Program, otherwise called the EEOP requirement. So the purpose of the EEOP is to ensure that opportunities are available to all groups of people. I understand there has been some changes related to the EEOP most recently. So I'll start by sharing an update on what we know and what we're doing in response to the updates and changes to the current EEOP reporting process. On March 11th of this year, so 2025, the reporting platform was temporarily paused by the Federal Office for Civil Rights. The reason we understand that this was paused was that their office is evaluating this program, and in their evaluation, they have removed this page and the associated reporting tools. So the page, when you click on the links that we have in this slide, the page will kind of give that memo that many of you have likely seen, that the reporting tool is paused while they assess the program, and there really is no more information or guidance related to that. There's no updates on the page about a date that it may become available or what to do in the meantime. So while this page is paused and unavailable, OCR, who is the Federal Office for Civil Rights, will not collect or review EEOP submission from recipients of federal funding or funding. So what we've decided to do in response to this, so during the FY26 site visits and monitoring processes, we will still ask grantees if they have completed the annual verification form, and if so, when the last date of completion was. So if you've completed it prior to March 11th, we'll ask for when that date was or when the most recent date of completion may have been. And we will keep track of the last dates of completion, and we'll follow up if this tool were to become available again. We'll follow up if the annual process may be due for your organization, and kind of keep a log and track of that as part of our monitoring process. I will say with a disclaimer, this is not guidance that we have this monitoring kind of process, or how we'll keep track of this information is not something that we have guidance that we have received from OCR or OVC. It is a process that we have decided to implement for our own tracking and follow-up purposes. So it's kind of just how we're choosing to navigate the process. But if you do have any questions related to that, we are happy to answer what we can. And although the reporting tool and collection of information is paused, I would still like to cover the requirements that we go through each year. again, in the instance that this tool may become available before we do the next training. So the PMP, again, has specific information related where to access this reporting tool and the specific steps to take. So there's two unique links that when and if it were to become available, there's two unique links to access. One link is specifically for organizations that receive direct federal funding. So an example of an organization that may receive direct federal funding, if you receive a grant directly from OVC or OVW, this first link here would be the link that you would use to do the annual reporting. A separate link for organizations that do not receive federal funding. So if the only federal funding you receive is the funding that you receive from MOVA, the second link would be the link that you would utilize to complete this requirement. So the second link is intended for organizations that do not receive direct federal funding. The process for both those who receive direct federal grants or who don't receive direct federal grants, the process is very similar for both, but it's just a different process. I think OCR had implemented the separate reporting platforms in FY24, so it's been a few years of the separation of links or reporting platforms. So the process is similar for both, but different job aids, different links for each. And normally when the collection of this information is not paused, this would be a form and process to follow every year. The next requirement that I will go through is related to non-discrimination of including employment practices and service provision. So this is a requirement of your award that you receive from MOVA. And the key part of this requirement is in the two different realms, both in service provision and in employment practices, there's parallel processes that need to be put in place. So the first being developing written practices to mitigate discrimination in both service provision and employment practices. In both of these areas, you want to ensure that employees or prospective employees and also participants of the services or prospective participants are informed of your organization's non-discrimination practices. So you would want these practices documented in order to show employees or participants how to file a grievance or complaint if there is alleged discrimination that may occur. Part of the requirements related to the civil rights requirement, there must be due process standards, and you would document in your policies and practices what this process looks like. So an example of this would be including who the person at your organization is that reviews and responds to grievances, what the timeline may be for responding to such a grievance, and how that information may be forwarded along or responded to for the complainant. On our website, we do have, it's under, and if one of our panelists can drop the link in the chat too for this, just so we have easy access. But on our website, under forms and resources, if you scroll down, we have so many different sample policies and templates that your organizations may use and may edit to fit the needs of your organization or the policies and practices that you may need to put in place. But there are examples of an anti-discrimination policy and complaint procedure. We have different samples for a procedure that you may use for employment practices and a procedure that you may use for service delivery. And anyone is welcome to use these templates, tailor them for your organization, but it is something that we look to provide samples for if that is something that you're looking to improve or change at your organization. So the submissions of findings of discrimination, this is more of a follow-up for the previous slide, but any adverse finding of discrimination based on protected categories such as race, color, national origin, sex, or religion from a federal or state court or federal or state agency must be reported to MOVA. So this can be forwarded to your MOVA program coordinator or sent to our general inbox, which is found in the slide. And it must be done so in a timely fashion as well. So there really isn't any like specific, like it must be done within 48 hours or within 24 hours, but the policy is within a timely fashion. And if appropriate, we may report any adverse findings to the Office for Civil Rights. So just as any grantee that is receiving funding from MOVA, MOVA also receives federal funding. So we also have to have a filing process and a policy in place. So one thing that we have created, and this is similar overview for what we have presented annually. So this may sound or look familiar to many people who have attended our grants, policies, and procedures trainings in the past, but we have a form that is accessible on MOVA's website, and this form is available to any person that is seeking services or to grantees that would like to file a complaint of discrimination and submit those complaints directly to MOVA. So this form is completely voluntary. It's not a form like within your processes or within your documented policies that you have to have included as a step to take when filing a grievance or a complaint. So it is voluntary, but the link here can bring you right to that form, to the complaint process and form that we have at MOVA. The last piece that I'll cover related to civil rights requirements is having a documented language access plan. The purpose of this requirement is to ensure services are accessible and available to everyone, including those with limited English proficiency. The language in this requirement is kind of vague, such as taking reasonable steps to provide meaningful access to programs and activities for persons with limited English proficiency. So what those reasonable steps are may look different across different organizations. But part of this means that there should be interpretation available for vital documents that are important to service provision at your organization. So if that's an intake form, for example, your organization should have a process in place to translate any necessary or vital documents that are related to service delivery. So this access to translation of documents and whether it's written translation or oral interpretation, this needs to be provided free of charge for the individual serves. So if there is a need for interpretation, it should be at no cost to the person that is seeking services. And it is something that you could build into your MOVA budget, something that we would absolutely support within your grant. And this slide does have additional resources that can be used, such as sample templates and policies that I've mentioned before, related to the civil rights requirements when receiving a grant from MOVA. I am going to pass it to Kristen Tavano, who is going to go through a few updates and reminders.
Thanks, Kristen. Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to be highlighting some of the things that your program coordinator will be tracking this year and providing you with some general reminders. All organizations who have federally approved indirect rates were reviewed and approved as part of the fiscal year 26 contracting process that we just went through over the past couple of weeks. Over the next fiscal year, your program coordinator will be completing a monthly status check of all federally approved indirect rate expiration dates. So during the contracting process, as we went through and reviewed and approved your indirect rate letters, if you have a federally approved rate, we also created a tracking document which lists out all expiration dates for anybody who has a federally approved indirect rate. Over the course of the next year, we'll be doing a monthly check. And if we discover, or your program coordinator discovers, that your organization has a rate that will be expiring within the next 30 days, they're going to reach out to you to get a status update and to obtain an updated letter and rate if it's changed since the last time you had an approved rate. Just a general reminder that if you choose to no longer negotiate for a federally approved rate, you may elect to use the de minimis rate, which has gone up to 15%. If you're in the process of negotiating a new federally approved rate, we will need an updated rate letter following the expiration date before we can reimburse for direct costs again. It's unallowable for us to reimburse for an expired indirect rate. Once you get that new rate and the approval letter, we will work with you to complete a budget amendment if your new rate is higher or lower than the expired one, or if you make that choice to cease negotiations with the federal government and just elect to use the de minimis rate. So just like with federally approved rates that I just talked about, program coordinators are going to be tracking the expiration date for rental agreements and leases this year. So we did the same exact process with the rental agreements that I just talked about with the federally approved indirect expiration dates. So we now have a tracking document which outlines all of the expiration dates for any organization that has rent on their approved budget. Program coordinators are going to be doing a monthly check of that as well. And just like with the indirect, if we discover that your organization has a rental agreement or a lease that's going to expire within the next 30 days, they're going to reach out to you for a status update, along with obtaining an updated rental agreement or lease and assisting with a budget amendment if the new rental cost is higher or lower than the existing one. Vacancy tracking. So you're probably very familiar with this process. This is going to be our third year of closely monitoring the statuses of vacancies that your organization might have. So a reminder that if you had a vacancy on your approved budget as of July 1st, which was the first day of this fiscal year, we are going to be requiring that you submit a staffing update form via eGrants on August 1st. So that due date is coming up in the next couple of days. Even if you filled the vacancy in July, if you on July 1st, you had a vacancy and then 2 weeks later you filled it, we're still asking that you complete the form and just let us know that that's done. If you do have a hire, you'll also be needing to complete the programmatic change form and potentially a budget amendment. But we just, rental agreements and indirect, we are tracking the number of vacancies that we saw on budgets as we approve them during the contracting process. So that's why even if you filled your vacancy within the first 30 days, we're still asking that you update us because we have a record that there was a vacancy at the start of the year. So if at the end of this first 30 days, which is August 1st, if you have an ongoing vacancy, your program coordinator will review your status update form that's submitted on August 1st and provide you with further instructions. Typically, what that involves is submission of staffing update forms every 30 days, and dependent on other factors such as the length of the vacancy that's on your approved budget or the number of vacancies that you have on our approved budget, your program coordinator may request to meet with you to provide technical assistance or discuss budget amendment options. Typically, the questions at the meeting will cover the status of your hiring process, any challenges that you're facing, and if there is an actual or anticipated impact to services and or your spending progress. And then just some general reminders. We're basically 100% operational on eGrants now, which is really exciting. Desk reviews will even be completed via eGrants in fiscal year 26. So just a reminder that these processes need to be completed via eGrants. You should be submitting programmatic change forms within 2 weeks of a change for any staffing changes on your approved budget. If you are a safe plan agency, that means that you should also be updating your court coverage agreements so that we are aware of who is in the courts and when. and who's providing coverage in instance of vacancies or staff absences. Reminder to be submitting the out-of-state travel and training request form at least 30 days prior to the event if it's an out-of-state travel or training. As I just mentioned, the staffing update forms must be submitted every 30 days or until your program coordinator states otherwise if you had vacancies as of July 1st. And finally, we're going to be doing this in, well, I guess it's almost late summer at this point, but we're going to be doing this process in the late summer and early fall. If you have a consultant or contract on your approved budget for over $10,000, and that's not the entire cost category, it's just for one particular line item, one particular contract, or one particular consultant, that's $10,000 or more, we're going to be going through the subcontract request form in eGrants in the next couple of weeks, and you'll hear more from your program coordinator if you have that on your budget. And then finally, I know there's a very good amount of people here today, is about 189 right now. Attendance at this training or viewing of this training is a grant requirement. At least one person from each organization must attend. So if you're here today, your agency has met the requirement. For those who are not in attendance, they have not met the requirement, and that's something, again, that we'll be tracking and reaching out to those organizations for as part of the mid-year review process. So if you're here, you can check that off your to-do list. You've met our requirement, and for everyone else, we'll be reaching out to them directly.
Thank you, Kristen. So next we are going to go through questions and answers. So before I move along to some questions that we plugged into the presentation today, we did get some questions during registration related to federal policies or how they kind of impact the awards that we administer at MOVA, many which we don't have answers to just yet. So we will do our best to answer any questions that you may have during our open question and answer period. But I did want to acknowledge that there were some questions that we didn't plug into the slide, and I'm also going to pause the recording of this presentation when we get to the final open questions and answers, just so we can kind of talk freely and not have that in the training recording. But I will go through a few questions that have been asked and that we thought would be helpful points of clarification. So the first being, should we report data on all program participants served by our organization through other funders? As Laura covered earlier, only individuals served and services provided under the funded award should be included in the OMT reports. That is when prorating will come in hand and MOVA's prorating tools will come in hand. So you should be making sure that any data that's reported to MOVA is only related to the funding and only encompasses the funding that you receive from MOVA and not including statistics or numbers from other funders. And where can I find the FY26 version of the policies and procedures manual? So we have posted this on our website. The FY25 in the previous version is no longer there, but if you'd still like the previous version for any reason, we're happy to share it. Just send us an email, either your program coordinator or the MOVA inbox. But the current version and the version that applies to the awards that you receive in FY26 is on our website here. So those are the only questions that I have plugged in. So I am going to ask the panelists to come back on, and we're going to open it up for any questions. Let me see if I can pause the recording to just so we can go through any questions that might come up.